This working? Yeah, great, thanks. Oh, I'm very honored to introduce our next panel. Is it Constanza here? Okay. Yeah, great, perfect. Okay, I'd like to invite to the stage, please, Susan Glasser as our moderator today, Brendan Boyle, Representative Brendan Boyle, and Paula Dobriansky, please, welcome to the stage. We have one more panelist, Constanza Stelson-Miller. She's just caught in traffic. She'll be here momentarily. Thank you. Hi, nice to see you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Neve. It's great to be here and back at the Aspen Security Forum. What a terrific and, I guess, very timely conversation. And here is my friend Constanza as well. This is called just-in-time paneling. It's a Washington. By the way, Constanza is my friend, and I am eternally grateful to her because I'm always the one who's too late. So thank you for that, Constanza. No, but seriously, this is about as timely a conversation, and maybe not necessarily for those who support Ukraine in a good way, timely conversation I can imagine having. And obviously, it's an important part of the agenda here in Washington. And yet it's remarkable that nearly 2 years after the Russian invasion, there's so much that remains uncertain, not only uncertain about what's exactly happening on the ground in Ukraine, but in particular, I think an enormous amount of uncertainty and questions surrounding the support for Ukraine, not only here in Washington, by the way, but of course in Europe as well. And looking ahead, I think, you know, the prognostications I've been hearing, and I want to bring our panel in on this, for 2024 are pretty grim when it comes to Ukraine, whether it is militarily, a sense from experts I've spoken with recently that Ukraine is going to be on the defensive in 2024. And then politically, not only reports of infighting inside Kyiv in a way that we haven't seen break out in public until recently, since the invasion, and then here in Washington. So let's begin at the end with what's going on right now and this uncertainty about whether President Biden is going to be able to deliver the as long as it takes support for Ukraine that he has been promising. Congressman, you know we're going to go to you on that. You have been watching this very closely, obviously are very involved in supporting Ukraine in the last nearly 2 years since the invasion. What can you tell us about the state of play right now in terms of the president's emergency funding request and its apparent fate in the Senate to be hooked onto the most undoable thing in Washington, which is solving our immigration and border crisis?
An issue, and it's a pleasure to be with all of you, an issue with respect to the border and immigration we've been attempting to solve since the original McCain-Kennedy bill 2 decades ago. So why not throw that into and add that to the mix of contentious issues? I was on a panel much like this several months ago, and a number of my fellow panelists were expressing, including a member of the Senate, expressing remarkable optimism that we would be able to get this Ukraine package passed. And I was sort of the skunk at the party, and I would have liked to have been wrong, but I am deeply, deeply concerned about Congress's ability to get this passed. One other thing I said 3 months ago that proved to be wrong, actually, at that time I said, I don't think we'll have a Senate problem, but we have a very serious House problem. House Republican leadership, who are narrowly in the majority, are badly, deeply divided internally. That has only, that's become doubled down upon over the last several months with voting out their own speaker and then an inability to get picks 2, 3, and 4 to be elected speaker. We're now on the 5th nominee on their side for speaker. So the reality is just the math. Approximately, if you take the last proxy vote on this issue, which was an amendment several weeks ago, roughly half the House Republicans voted supporting aid to Ukraine, and about half of the House Republicans voted against it. And indeed, 100% of House Democrats voted for it. So when you look at that math, you would say, geez, that's roughly 3/4 of the House of Representatives. What's the problem? The problem is, of course, the most important power in any legislative body is the power to control the calendar. If you are any Republican speaker right now, you would quite rightly be very concerned that if you put a bill on the floor that delivers any sort of aid to Ukraine, that might be used against you as part of an internal coup against you, as we have already seen in the last couple months. So that's the House problem. What is different from several months ago, and unfortunately, to my surprise, we now have a Senate problem as well. And it does seem as if, and I'm picking this up from friends of mine who serve in the Senate, that there are enough members of the Senate Republican Conference who, at least for now, want to show they have the back of their House Republican colleagues before, possibly swinging over to our side. So, as it stands right now, I am, sad to say, deeply concerned about this ever getting done.
So, Paula, you are a longtime observer, of course, of not only Ukraine and supporter of Ukraine, but also of the politics of Republican foreign policy here in Washington. First of all, do you agree with the congressman that there is now a Senate problem to go along with the House problem? And, more broadly, maybe you can help us understand a little bit, like, is it even conceivable in today's Republican Party, whatever that has become? It's clearly not your grandfather's Republican Party. The long-term trend, the movement of direction, right? The direction of travel here seems to be away from a long-term significant U.S. commitment, whether the next president is Biden or Trump. Tell us a little bit about how you see it playing out beyond even just this particular emergency spending bill.
I'd be glad to, and I'm delighted to be here this afternoon with all of you. I would be very curious as to the congressman's reaction to what I'm about to say. First, Susan, I believe that there are different positions that are taken within the Republican Party. For myself and for Republicans who I'm engaged and associated with, we categorize ourselves as internationalists. We're interested in investing in ways which are going to protect our national security and our national security interests. And that's through the prism in which we see the developments in Ukraine. That it's not just only about Ukraine, but it is about the security of not only our transatlantic relationship, but our own national security interests and even that of the global community. So first, I'd say that there isn't a monolithic view within the Republican Party. But this is the part that I'd be curious as to your view. My own impression is that there's what constitutes a kind of very loud, vocal, but minority. I don't know if, in terms of Republicans in Congress, if when push comes to shove in terms of where they come down on the issue, at least I'd like to believe in what I've seen, they have been supportive overall of the goals for Ukraine. And that just brings me to the third and last point I'd like to make. And that is, I think it's also worth noting, actually, someone who actually used to be a Republican staffer, Mark Thiessen. He actually just recently wrote a piece in the Washington Post. And in that article, he wrote about the $65 billion of military assistance. And he said 80% of that actually goes in support of American jobs, American factories. And they did a very intense study, actually, that took months of literally going into districts and looking at the equation. And I just submit that to you. I think that word needs to get out more. I don't know that it has. It's a very significant one. And by the way, in my book, that's actually matters not only for our security, but for that of Ukraine. Because you can't have limitless, munitions. You have to have manufacturing. You have to have strong industrial base. So it's in our interest, it's in Ukraine's interest, it's in Europe's interest, it's in the global community's interest. But we're benefiting 80% statistically. So that's
Well, my
reaction.
guess is, unfortunately, Paul, that you're speaking to the converted here, right? The challenge and the question, I think that, I'll bring Constanza in on this too. The question is, how did we get to this spot, right? Was it a question of the administration just not getting the right time, or, wrapping it up in things like the border, or were the politics always going to be, sort of going south on this? And what I'm struck by is that it's particularly terrible timing for Ukraine, Constanza, because it's not only this funding crisis now in the United States, but Europe really looks to be a different picture, it seems to me, than it did even a few months ago. Get us up to speed on, are they also potentially at risk of, pulling the plug to a certain extent?
All right. First off, I want to apologize to my fellow panelists and to all of you for being late. I, in life, always try not to get on the wrong side of Anya Manuel and Neve King. And I'm sorry, I was running a meeting that went into overtime. Apologies to all of you. But very happy to be here on what is a subject close to all of our hearts, and which I think all of us believe has ramifications for national security, transatlantic security, and global security that go well beyond the survival of Ukraine. And yes, we are looking at a situation where, until about a week ago, the assumption was that at the upcoming December Council in Brussels, the European Union would unanimously offer the opening of accession negotiations to Ukraine. This is something that that the German government has been pushing very strongly. And about a week ago, Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban said that he was going to veto this. The French President Macron is having dinner with him tonight. I think there is a sense, or at least the scuttlebutt in European corridors, is that this is not about Orban once more trying to negotiate for something, which is something that he likes to do and has done very forcefully in the past, but that in this situation he is actually trying to stop the accession. He means it. He's trying to stop the opening of accession negotiations. This could not just, I think this would not just add to the sense that we have run out of options for Ukraine, something that Russia will exploit. I mean, it's frankly already a terrible psychological moment for all of us, right? This kind of, politics is a futures market, and just talking about these things, just the idea of the president being unable to get through another supplemental, us Europeans being unable to follow through on what we know to be central to European security, changes the market already. It empowers and enables the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, and the North Koreans. And that's not good for us, it's not good for you.
Let me ask a little bit, now we're at the end of the year. The year began with big hopes for Ukraine in terms of its military success. That was part of the rationale for the United States and European partners contributing as much as they could to build up. I think the Pentagon, was putting out all these press releases about the mountain of steel that they were building, and the mountain of steel has not been able to produce meaningful results on the battlefield since the counteroffensive began over the spring and summer. You've now seen that go public with Ukraine's chief military officer giving an interview, very striking interview to The Economist recently. This has begun a kind of a political cycle of recriminations in Kyiv. But I'm just curious, what does that mean here in Washington, right? How much was support, do you think, among your colleagues conditioned on the idea, that there was going to be progress made, that there was going to be winning on the battlefield? How much does that affect people's willingness to long-term, commit to this or not?
You might be surprised by my answer. Precious little.
So this is about D.C., basically.
It's about D.C. and about primary politics and about party coalitions. Look, I think for those of us who are absolutely committed to this, we're going to be committed regardless of what's happening on the battlefield, regardless of whether or not the insurgency has met, the counterinsurgency has met all of the goals that were originally laid out. Clearly, it has not. What's interesting, and we kind of were talking a little bit both separately about what's going on the Republican side right now. That's not about what's happening on the battlefield in Ukraine. That's about internal party politics. And I happen to be a Democratic member, but sincerely, I can take that hat off and offer, my best analysis from someone who's observing this up front and who has friendships on the Republican side of the aisle and who talked to me about what's going on. You have roughly 3 different groups within the House Republicans, let's say, and I think Republicans writ large. The first group is the kind of folks who we're always familiar with. The people who, Mitch McConnell is a great example of this. The traditional Republican foreign policy from Eisenhower through Reagan and both Bushes. Muscular national defense, proud of NATO, proud of the U.S. leading the transatlantic alliance in standing up to first Soviet and then Russian aggression. So that would be the first group. And they still are barely a majority, but just holding on. Then you have on the other extreme, for lack of a better term, the isolationists. The Marjorie Taylor Greenes, folks like that, who, yes, are very loud, get a lot of outsized attention, but frankly, while they are the minority, they are also in the ascendancy. They are a much bigger number today than they were a year and a half ago. Then there's that third group, and I actually think the new House Speaker is part of this third group. They are, in their head and their heart, part of the old traditional Republican foreign policy, but they're also looking over their shoulder at their next primary. They're having to deal with, I won't say who, but one House Republican in particular told me about a pretty painful town hall he had in which he was getting grilled by voter after voter in a very Republican part of his pretty Republican district. He was getting grilled because of his support for Ukraine funding. That middle group who have been voting and want to vote for Ukraine funding, but are very concerned that this will be used against them and could knock them out in a primary. By the way, they're pretty rational for having that concern. It's that third group, actually, that I think holds the balance of power as to whether or not we're going to get this done or not.
So I want to bring in Paula on this sort of cultural anthropology of today's Republicans, but a quick follow-up question for you, Congressman. Yeah. Do you think on this latter group and in general, the fear that you see inside some of the Republican colleagues around support for Ukraine, do you think that is inherently because there's a kind of a grassroots, like, we want to focus on the United States and not on, foreign wars, or is it specific to, the sort of Donald Trump, Tucker Carlson beating away on this and support for Russia and for Putin that, is sort of very inconsistent with the Republican Party of old?
The latter more than the former, but some combination of the two. And there's a great anecdote that actually captures this. I don't know who report, it might have been Politico or one of the media outlets that covers the ongoings of Capitol Hill every day, reported that Boris Johnson was here about 6 weeks ago and was meeting with House Republican members, including Freedom Caucus members, urging them to support funding for Ukraine. And apparently, after a day of meetings, he turned to someone who he was with and he said, "Who is this Tucker Carlson?" Because all of these House Republicans keep telling me they're concerned about him and they're afraid about what he says every night. Now, obviously, he's off.
This might be a tad apocryphal. Let's just stipulate to that. But it certainly tells you about what people are hearing, right? What people are hearing.
Exactly. So that is what is driving the concern that so many of my House Republican colleagues have in terms of the impact on their own careers.
So, Paula, I suppose 10 years ago, if I said, tell me about the foreign policy of the Tucker Carlson Republicans, you might not have believed that this was a serious conversation, and yet we are where we are. Do you agree with the Congressman's sort of, typography of, the different camps of Republicans right now? And how come, is there a moment where we're going to see kind of the Mitch McConnell faction reassert itself? That clearly in conversations with folks, even at the White House, that was clearly the expectation, right? That sort of the Senate Republicans would take it over the line, that they would be responsible. Is that still a legitimate assumption?
Well, first, in commenting, I think you have described, I think very fairly, and I think you're closer to it than I am. So that's why I was deferring to you on Susan's question, quite honestly. But Susan, your question to me is really, where is this going? Where can we expect it to go? I guess I will be a little biased in my own answer because I happen to be part of a coalition that believes very strongly, actually, and it has brought together a wide variety of players in the international field. I'm part of a coalition known as the Vandenberg Coalition, and named after Senator Vandenberg. And basically, he was someone who did place a real premium on international engagement. And the feeling that the United States, it's always in our interests. That doesn't mean that we should be ignoring, key problems and issues at home, but it's in our interest in terms of engagement, in terms of leading abroad. I also, as I think Susan knows, I come out of the Reagan administration. And I think when I look back at that period, that was truly a heyday. I have visuals in my mind of Reagan leaning over, if I could say, or Tip O'Neill leaning over the other way, the two of them, basically collaborating, working on a wide range of issues. And by the way, that certainly didn't mean that they were in agreement. I think there are so many people, at least I'm around, who look at that period, that space, how that mattered. It mattered because we were working closely together for America, for American interests in this case.
So, Constanza, first of all, what are your European colleagues when they observe this from afar? I'm sure you're hearing a lot from them about what is really going on in American foreign policy right now. Is there, what president, whether it even if it's not Trump, how is it that you would trust, if you're a European ally or partner, a commitment from the United States on a foreign policy issue?
That's a really important question. Let me preface my comments by saying something that I think cannot be said often enough, which is that we Europeans, and I know this because I travel in Europe all the time, and I personally are profoundly grateful for America's bipartisan leadership and the leadership of the president on protecting Ukraine, right? Europe would be in a much direr place had it not been for America's decision to lead in this way, for investing $75 billion in defending Ukraine and thereby defending Europe. Thank you. The two points I want to make, one about the Biden administration and one about the other side of the aisle. I have former colleagues and friends who are in this administration now, and I admire the president and his closest advisors, cabinet members, for their innate transatlanticism, their commitment to the protection of democracy against rising autocrats. And I admire the staff of this administration for their extraordinarily sophisticated, subtle, and modern take on the current situation. I do think that they may have a blind spot, and I think that blind spot is the existence of adversaries who see us as absolute enemies. That's my first point. I believe they don't understand hate and anger and enmity. On the Republican side, it's become fashionable to dissect the Republicans into different tribes. And I get that, I've done that too. I think what that understates is the degree to which, in the domestic camp as well, and in the Republican camp, I'm sorry to say, there are enemies of representative democracy. And that undercutting the president and bipartisan cooperation in the Senate on this crucial issue is a way of undercutting the effectiveness and the legitimacy of representative democracy. And as you know, I'm fully aware that we have people who are doing the same thing in Europe and in my country, and who are helped by some of our adversaries. But in other words, what I'm trying to say here is that Ukraine isn't even the point here. The point is to say, to the American people, you know what, representative democracy really isn't working for you. We're going to do a better job. Only we can solve the problem, right?
Well, I know we're just about out of time. Congressman, I'm going to give you the last word. I noticed with some alarm, and forgive me to the audience, I know that this panel was never going to be the most cheery and upbeat of the discussions, but maybe that's a good transition into the drinks that Anya has promised later this evening. But Congressman, I'm going to give you the quick final word because we're out of time here. Your colleague in the Senate, Chris Murphy, he's been doing the hands-on negotiating here, did not leave us with a lot of hope around this. And you know, both he and President Biden yesterday, I was really struck by a new note of alarmism that I haven't heard from them before, saying essentially the consequence of failing to vote, to consensus vote, failing to go with what we think a majority of Congress wants, which is to support Ukraine, is going to pretty directly lead to Putin engaging in conflict in the relatively, short-term future, not just with Ukraine, but with a NATO country. Do you agree with that?
What's the old John McCain line? It's always darkest before it's totally dark. So I was thinking of that when you were speaking. First, let me inject one note of optimism. And I've been elected office now, I'm concluding my 15th year. There have been negotiations, torturous negotiations, in which it looked entirely bleak, and then suddenly, out of nowhere, there was a breakthrough. So we should don't totally give up hope, but I also was not going to mislead people about just how dire this situation is. Now, if the United States of America really does walk away from Ukraine funding, it is de facto walking away from the transatlantic alliance. I think the consequences would be unimaginable. Yes, I do believe Vladimir Putin, if he were ultimately then successful in Ukraine, would absolutely pocket the win and move on. This is someone who has engaged in some way or another, interfering with the democracies of many NATO countries. Of course, he first moved on Georgia in 2008. We saw what he's done on Ukraine. Why in the world would he stop if he is successful in this effort?
All right, well, I didn't promise anybody a happy ending, but we are where we are, and I really appreciate, in fact, such a thoughtful and I think important briefing for all of us on the situation. So thank you, Congressman. Thank you, Paula. Thank you.